So, moving along in our discussion of operant conditioning, let's talk about the importance of immediacy. Imagine you're training your dog to sit, and so you deliver the stimulus, which is the command sit, and he engages in the correct behavior. He sits because he's a good boy. You then realize that you're out of treats and you have to drive to the store to buy more treats. When you get home, you give him a treat for sitting. And so the next day, you again deliver the stimulus, sit, but he doesn't sit. And you're scratching your head wondering, well, why not? You reinforced that good sitting behavior only yesterday, and he seemed to get it. What went wrong here? To influence a behavior the most effectively, the consequence has to occur immediately or directly following the behavior. It has to happen ASAP. If you wait, for example, while you run to the store to get more treats, other behaviors are happening during that waiting time. And so what ends up happening is you're actually reinforcing the behavior closest to the presence of the consequence. In other words, the behavior that occurred closest to when you gave the treat, not the behavior that you necessarily want to reinforce, is the one that the contingency is acting on. Maybe when you got home from the store and went to deliver the reinforcer, your puppy had just scratched his ear. Well, they don't understand that their treat was actually for that sitting that occurred 10 minutes ago. Now he thinks that he's getting a treat for scratching his ear. You could very easily have remedied that situation by just delivering the sit command again when you got home from the store, and requiring that the puppy were to sit again before you gave that treat. But if you just come home and give the treat, it's not going to work the way you want it to. Now, may be wondering, what about a classroom full of students who get a pizza party at the end of every month where they all complete their behavior on time? Isn't that just a delayed reinforcement? Why does that work? That's a really good question. Delayed consequences, and remember, consequences are just something that follow the behavior. Delayed consequences don't reinforce a behavior directly, but what we can do is combine them with language. Okay? We can explain a contingency to a group of students. Okay, and that helps them to understand and extend it further. You wouldn't be able to explain the contingency to a dog because they just don't have the cognitive capacity to be able to grasp the concept. But a room full of students, you can explain. Okay. So when we just implement a contingency on its own, it needs to be immediate for it to take effect. But we can combine it with language and rules and understanding in order to help get around that just a little bit. Now, we talked about extinction in the concept in the what's the word I want? In the context, there it is, the context of classical conditioning. But what happens when a previously reinforced behavior stops getting reinforced? Okay, this is also called extinction. So with classical conditioning, extinction refers to breaking that bond between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. In operant conditioning, it means that when we no longer reinforce a behavior, when we stop reinforcing a behavior that used to be reinforced, that is also extinction. Since the behavior is no longer being met with reinforcement, the frequency of the behavior should decrease. So here's an example. Think about a 5-year-old girl. Let's call her Adriana. Adriana kicks and hits her mom during dinner because she doesn't like what mom is serving. And so Adriana's history, her behavior has a history of getting reinforced. She hits and kicks, and mom just makes her a new meal. Okay, so if Adriana doesn't want to eat the chicken and veggies that mom made for her, Adriana acts up and mom makes her mac and cheese, and then everyone is happy. So the reason that she's engaging in that kicking and hitting behavior is to gain access to another food item. But one day mom has enough and she says, you know what? I can't just keep making multiple dinners every night. This isn't working for me. So she says, from now on, I am not going to make you a new dinner. You're going to eat what's on the table. Okay. She's essentially putting an extinction procedure in place. She is no longer going to provide reinforcement for that hitting and kicking behavior. So when Adriana engages in that hitting and kicking, she's no longer getting access to a new food. We are no longer delivering reinforcers for that previously reinforced behavior. Over time, eventually, she'll learn that hitting and kicking doesn't get her access to different choices, and that behavior should decrease. But here's the thing: before it gets better, it gets worse. When we use an extinction procedure, there's this interesting phenomenon that takes place. It's called an extinction burst. And so, shortly after we start withholding that reinforcer, we see the undesired behavior initially increase in intensity. So, let's look at this chart in the context of the last example. So if we imagine that the horizontal axis is the amount of days, I know this says screaming, but let's pretend that the vertical axis is the amount of aggressive behaviors that Adriana was engaging in. We see that they're relatively high. They are occurring at, a pretty high rate. This horizontal or this vertical line here is, say, this is where we implement the extinction procedure. So after this point, we are starting to withdraw that reinforcement. No new food after this point. So Adriana is used to getting a new food option when she hits and kicks. Now, all of a sudden, the hitting and kicking isn't working. Well, with an extinction procedure, we would expect her to learn, well, it doesn't work, and we'd expect the behavior to decrease. And it does eventually. But look what happens first. Okay. So when the hitting and kicking isn't working, the first thing that she's going to try is hitting harder, kicking more, screaming louder. Maybe now we've added biting or spitting into the mix. I think of it as kind of like upping the ante. Okay, so it wasn't working before. I'm going to double down and I'm going to really go at it hard until I get what I want. So what this usually means is that the behavior first increases temporarily before it eventually begins to come down, as long as we're consistent with withholding that reinforcement. But extinction bursts can be particularly challenging for parents and teachers for a couple reasons. One is that it can be dangerous if we're talking about aggressive behaviors or self-injurious behaviors. If Adriana is hurting herself or others, mom could really get hurt. And this is an even bigger issue if there's other siblings in the mix. But the second reason is that it looks like it's not working. And so parents and teachers really easily get frustrated and they say, why am I doing this? You told me that if I just didn't give her the new food, that the behavior would get better. It's getting worse. Okay. So it can be really hard to understand that you really have to stick to your guns during an extinction procedure. The worst thing that you can do is start an extinction procedure and then start reinforcing the behavior again. Because what happens is you end up reinforcing those higher rates of behavior. If right around here, mom gave in and said, forget it, here, take the mac and cheese, please just stop. Now we've reinforced those higher levels of behavior. So whereas we had aggression occurring at about a 6 before, now it's occurring at an 8 to 10, and we've just reinforced that it's going to maintain at that higher level. So the moral is that when you start an extinction procedure, you really need to see it through. You absolutely cannot go back in the middle, or you just end up with worse behavior than what you had to start with. This is a silly little example. I think it's actually someone's class project that I found on YouTube, but it's a really good example of an extinction burst.
Let them knock upon my door until their hands are black and blue. I'm not answering for no one until my man and I are through.
So what's the behavior in the video? We saw her knocking on the door, right? And then the consequence was that she'd get to hang out with a friend. Well, so knocking is getting reinforced by friend time. And at first that works. In the first examples, that works. But then suddenly knocking is no longer reinforced. She starts to up the ante. She's knocking louder and longer and harder. She's banging, she's hammering on the door. That's the extinction burst. But eventually, when hammering on the door still doesn't earn reinforcement, she gives up and she stops knocking and she walks away because she realizes that her behavior is not being met with reinforcement. So we initially had the knocking behavior. We see that burst when knocking wasn't met with reinforcement by the door opening, and then eventually we see it drop off. Just a fun little example. Now, you may be thinking that some things may be reinforcing to one person, but not to another, or that something might be reinforcing at one point, but not another. And you'd be right. And so that brings us to deprivation and satiation. For a reinforcer to be effective, the individual must be in a state of deprivation in relation to the reinforcer. This basically just means that they have to want the reinforcer. It can't be something that they aren't interested in or sick of. Food is a great example. So, a child who hasn't eaten since breakfast is great. They're probably going to find snacks particularly reinforcing because they're hungry. So, in relation to the reinforcer or snacks, the child is in a state of deprivation. They are hungry. Satiation is the flip side of that. This occurs when the individual has been repeatedly exposed to the reinforcer and the reinforcer is no longer reinforcing. So, a child who just ate lunch probably isn't going to find snacks particularly reinforcing because they're not hungry. And so, what this means is that we have to choose our reinforcers carefully, and we have to be willing and able to switch things up as the situation calls for it. So, oftentimes, especially if we're working with kids, or animals, it's really helpful to have multiple reinforcers, maybe some that are edible, but also some that are not. So things like preferred toys, preferred videos, access to a video game, access to hugs or praise or whatever other things they might want. Because if we start to see satiation occurring, if we start to see the individual not working as well for the reinforcer, then we can switch it up and we can give them something else. Now, we use operant conditioning all the time in our lives. You probably do it all the time and don't even realize it. Before I went to graduate school, I worked as a behavior analyst in classrooms with kids with autism or developmental disabilities. And we saw operant conditioning all the time as a means to help shape behaviors. And so we often hear about operant conditioning in the context of kids with special needs, but there's a lot of other ways that we can use it too. And so, one technique for changing behavior is shaping. So, in shaping, what we're doing is we are conditioning a target behavior by progressively reinforcing behaviors that come closer and closer to the target. Say, I want to teach a kid to zip up her coat. I might provide reinforcement first for just putting her hands near the zipper. After a while, once she's mastered that, I might provide reinforcement for taking the two ends of the coat and pulling them close together. But then I have to stop reinforcing just holding the coat. Then eventually, once she's mastered pulling the ends together, I might reinforce putting the zip part in the other zip part. I never know what they're called. But then I have to stop reinforcing just pulling the ends together. And then eventually I might reinforce getting that pincher grip on the zipper and pulling on it. So I'm shaping, I'm building, I'm starting with a behavior sort of far away, and I'm working my way closer and closer to what it is that I actually want to reinforce. Chaining is another strategy. This involves linking interrelated behavior together to form a longer series of behaviors. And so the example I like to use for chaining is washing hands. Okay, so think about what it might look like when you wash your hands. You might walk into the bathroom, you turn on the light, you go to the sink, you turn on the water, you wet your hands, you get soap, you rub your hands together, and so on and so forth. In a chaining protocol, each step becomes a reinforcer for the previous step. And so we use chaining to help teach a series of behaviors. So something like hand washing that has multiple steps. Then there's the Premack principle. And so this is where we use a behavior to reinforce another behavior. We might use one more desirable behavior to reinforce a less desirable behavior. Ever hear a parent say, or maybe you're a parent and you've said, no dessert until you eat your vegetables? Well, the behavior of eating dessert is reinforcing the behavior of eating vegetables. Or no video games until you've done your homework. Well, the more desirable behavior of playing video games then serves as a reinforcer for the less desirable behavior of doing homework. We also see the development of superstitious behavior that can result from operant conditioning. For example, in one study, B.F. Skinner put food deprived pigeons in a box. They were getting reinforced non contingently, which we're going to talk about that in the next lecture. Basically, it just means that it doesn't matter what they were doing. They get the reinforcement when they get it. It's not dependent on their behavior or them doing anything specific. And so Skinner started to see that some of the pigeons started doing these really bizarre things. Say one pigeon happened to be standing on one foot when the food arrived. Well, he might associate that with the food and develop this accidental link between standing on one foot and getting fed. Another common example is wearing a certain pair of socks and your sports team wins the playoffs. And then from then on, you have this superstitious belief that I have to wear this pair of socks or my team's not going to win the game. And so this is a good example of how operant conditioning can lead to superstitious behaviors. Now, we use all different types of reinforcers. The most basic and the most effective type are primary reinforcers. These are ones that don't need to be taught, they are innate. I don't need to teach you to value food or water or sleep, for example. But then there's secondary reinforcers. These are ones that get paired with a primary reinforcer to have conditioned value. Money is a great example in our society. If you were an alien from a foreign planet and you came to our world and someone handed you a $20 bill, you wouldn't necessarily know what to do with it. You can't eat it, you can't drink it. You can use it to trade for other things, but you need to learn that. That's not something inherent or built in. We also see this with things like stickers. So earning stickers when you were a kid, like getting a star on your star chart. That sticker inherently doesn't have any value. You have to teach that to have value. Usually what happens is you're able to trade in those stickers for something good, just like we do with money. And so this is called a token economy. Token economies are systems for reinforcing appropriate behavior and extinguishing inappropriate ones. We often see these in psych hospitals or in schools for kids with special needs. So basically, what we do is we identify target behaviors or behaviors that we want to change, either increasing, like hand raising, or decreasing, like shouting out, and we provide reinforcement contingent upon the engagement or lack of engagement in those behaviors. So, say you want a child to raise their hand more. Well, maybe we create a token system where we give them a token every time they raise their hand, and eventually they can redeem those tokens for a larger reinforcer. And so, you often see a board that looks something like this. There's a spot that says, I'm working for. And so, maybe there's a picture of a certain food or a certain activity or a certain game. When they engage in the correct or target behavior, they get a star. When they get 5 stars, they can then trade it in for that higher level or primary reinforcer. And this actually is a great transition into schedules of reinforcement. And so that's going to be the topic of the next lecture.